Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on volunteers in schools. This is part of the Office of School Safety and Security, of which I am a member. In fact, I'm a specialist in school safety and security as part of our team. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Jason to advance to the next slide. So who is the office, or what is the Office of School Safety and Security? Well, what we aren't, which is what we stress immediately, is we are not an enforcement program. Having said that, we can probably be better friends now. Anyway, all kidding aside, no, we are a resource to assist you in your schools with safety and security issues. I know top of mind right now is COVID-19, but there's a lot of other threats that existed before COVID hit that still exist today. We are focused primarily on school emergency operations plans and the work that goes into doing that, the planning work, if you will. But we also do a lot of training to include webinars like this. And we've actually been on the road recently helping with school in-service training in that area. I think we've topped in the last 10 days more than 800 school teachers and other staff that we've brought training to. So we're very proud of that. So who's on our team? There you can see, it's always important to introduce the boss and the assistant executive director as well. So John Parker is our executive director. Cindy Swearingen, you can see there, assistant executive director. We have 3 specialists, myself and Steve and Jason. And then we have Lindsay Moore, who's our coordinator, who is definitely the glue for the organization here, which keeps us all on track. When it comes to the specialists, Jason and I, we work the west side of the state. Steve and Cindy there, they work the east side of the state. So today's webinar about volunteerism in our schools, we truly cannot get by in the education community without volunteers. So we've got some great speakers to impart their wisdom in this area. I'm going to mention their names here, but I'll give more information about each as they're introduced to give their particular presentation. Jane York is president-elect of the Oklahoma PTA. Kevin Sims, superintendent, Minko Public Schools, and Tyler Bridges, superintendent, comes to us from Clinton Public Schools. So Jason, if you will advance. And I should have mentioned, thank you, Jason. He's running the back side of this. He's the one advancing our slides. So I think that's a great quote there. At the end of the day, the most overwhelming key to a child's success is the positive involvement of parents, certainly. And I'm going to add the positive involvement of their school and the volunteers there, as well as all the staff. And then we always need volunteers, but we need them in an appropriate manner. We need them in a well-placed manner. So when it comes to your volunteers, it's all about building and maintaining a strong volunteer, a core of volunteers, if you will. And the more we do things like that, it means a more resilient school and a more resilient school district. Of course, volunteers have been around for schools for many, many years. And we're going to ask our speakers to talk about volunteerism before coronavirus and then post-coronavirus as well. I wish I could say COVID was gone, but of course it's not. And I know that working with people, anyone who doesn't have a full-time job at that school, I know there's been a push, certainly last year and this year as well, to limit the amount of folks within your school buildings and all that. So how do you still get the needs you address that you need to have addressed with volunteers in that climate? So we're going to have some lessons learned here. We're going to be sharing those things, and I'm really looking forward to it. So before we go any further, a little housekeeping. Please begin now posting any of the questions you have in the chat. We're going to answer those questions at the end after all 3 speakers have made their presentation. But along the way here, don't be shy. Please post your chat. If you think of it as a question, somebody else is probably thinking of it as well. Additionally, we're recording today's webinar. It will be posted on our website probably in another day or so. So look forward to that. If you, in fact, need to look back at the transcript, what was said, it'll all be out there. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first speaker. Jane York is the president-elect of Oklahoma PTA. Jane began volunteering on her local PTA board in 2007. Since that time, she has served in various positions at the local, her district, as well as state levels, most recently completing her second term as the Broken Arrow District PTA president. She is passionate about developing volunteer leaders and advocating for Oklahoma's children. Of course, volunteerism is a great representation of your advocacy for the kids and the staff within Oklahoma schools. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jane. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michael Ann. I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about PTA and some differences in PTA and PTOs, as well as some examples from the Broken Arrow area of things that we did in the schools pre-COVID and during COVID. I had hoped too that we would say post-COVID. But the first thing that I want to talk about is the difference in a PTO, which is a parent-teacher organization, which can be any sort of organization that has parents and teachers in it. Booster clubs also could fall under that. Those groups are comprised of families focused on issues at their school site. They're typically not organized with a larger network, so they make decisions within their own schoolyard, if you will. Unaffiliated groups don't have the support that local PTA groups have from their state and national organizations. They have no help with bylaws, financial management, leadership training, et cetera, by and large. So PTA is a parent-teacher association, and we are the oldest and largest child advocacy association in America, with over 24,000 local PTA units and nearly 4 million members. So I want to talk to you a little bit about national PTA to start. Some of national PTA's partners are Google, LifeTouch, Mathnasium, Office Depot, TikTok, just to name a few. And what we were able to do in partnership with those organizations, National PTA has 6 programs that are available nationwide to all of our units. We have the Reflections Art Program, where students submit art, fine arts in various categories, and compete on the state and national level. We have the Family Reading Experience, which is for K through 5 families, and it's an engagement for families that teaches core reading skills. We have the STEM Plus Families program, which is obviously interactive initiatives with STEM. The Healthy Lifestyles program, which teaches the 3 pillars of healthy minds, body, and earth. We have PTA Connected, which is a digital program for parents and teachers, and a School of Excellence program, which is a year-long initiative that helps PTA leaders become key partners in school improvement and family and school partnerships. National PTA also offers grants based on local units' needs. National PTA offers annual conventions for training and education at the state and national level, not just the national level. John Maxwell was one of our featured speakers this year at virtual national convention. They also offer an annual legislative conference. It was virtual this year as well, but we were able to meet virtually with Oklahoma congressmen and senators and their staff to discuss issues that are impacting children in Oklahoma. So the biggest part of PTA really is advocacy. It's not, I like to say, it's not your mama's bake sale. It is an advocacy organization first and foremost. In the state of Oklahoma, we have monthly advocacy meetings for our leaders around the state to discuss the legislative agenda and our plans to support or oppose any of those items that affect children. We use a program called Voter Voice. That's a digital advocacy software program, and it's used to contact and encourage our members to take action on things like supporting critical funding for school infrastructure, and for statewide family engagement centers. Those are the two of the things that we are working with right now at the state level. So my personal experience comes from Broken Arrow Public Schools. I have participated in the, like Mike Lynn said, the local unit level at my children's school, and on the council level. So in Broken Arrow, we have a council that's comprised of 23 PTA units around the district. So at that level, we as a council meet every month with our PTA presidents and the principals from all of those sites. And we did this pre-COVID and during COVID. We were able to meet in person every time except for once. We had to meet virtually there, but district leadership attends those meetings. And like I said, our principals. So we provide training and education, not only for PTA, but also for the local group of what's happening in our district and how we can advocate for the children in our area. So when COVID hit, though, of course, everything was shut down in March of 2020. No one was meeting. Oklahoma PTA, got a policy out that we could meet virtually and what that was going to look like. And the great thing about that too is that our national organization and state organization didn't stop. We still had an infrastructure to help us keep meeting the needs of our kids. But our Broken Arrow Council sponsored a 6 weeks long virtual fine arts contest for the students in our district. So we did contests with art, poetry, photography, and Lego builds, which was a really popular one for all of the students in our district. And we gave away gift cards for each age category and asked Broken Arrow teachers to be the judges of those. And so we felt like that still engaged the kids, and that also gave them something to do when our district, in March, no one had really plans on the table. So that was something that we could help keep our kids engaged while the district was really gathering up what they were going to do for the end of the year. We talked about meeting in person, and then this past year, our units largely met virtually or outside when it was not too hot in Oklahoma, since we were not allowed in the buildings, in the student buildings. But we were able to continue meeting. Pre-COVID, PTA is pretty heavy in providing money for field trips. Budgets were cut, and so field trips and buses for field trips went away. And so that is something that we typically would provide, especially at the elementary level for each grade level. So the way we flipped that was that we partnered with companies to do virtual field trips. So we have an elementary school that brought in Radical Reptile Fun, and that was held during the school day. So each child was able to participate in that virtual field trip. And then PTA provided them a little plastic critter to take home with them at the end of that field trip. Pre-COVID, for family engagement, a lot of our schools have a Watchdog Dads program. We held family movie nights, bingo nights. A lot of our units still did the same things. They've just moved to a virtual platform. So there was still a lot of family engagement going on. Fundraising, of course, took a turn. And my favorite part about that, we all need money to be able to do programs, but we learned that advocacy doesn't need as much money as we might think. Field trips do, but instead of selling cookie dough from a catalog, we were able to have virtual auctions. There was a unit that each class painted a pumpkin, and then they auctioned those off on Facebook to the community. The community was able to get involved in that. There was also a virtual calendar by a date that some of our units participated in. Pre-COVID, we had a group who did a Vincent Van Grinch art night around December that they provided for families, and they flipped that to a virtual art night where their art teacher provided art instruction for families on a Facebook Live. And so PTA provided up to 2 paint kits per family, but families could buy more kits for an additional cost. Typically, we would have in-person back to school parties for families at a lot of our elementary units, especially, and those flipped to drive-through parties. We were still out there letting school staff and parents know that PTA was still going to be engaged. It just wouldn't look the same. So there were giveaways of school supplies and masks and all the things that typically we might do just in a drive-through fashion. And the same with our holiday parties. We had a couple of units that did a drive-through holiday party. So they decorated the school with lights and up as characters, Christmas characters, and gave candy and things away through the drive-through. Some of our sites allowed one parent to come in for a holiday party. And then we did have a unit that made a party kit for every classroom, complete with plates and forks and the snacks that they would need, all the food and supplies that they would need. So even though parents couldn't come in, those kits were delivered to the classroom for the teachers. So I think really what we learned is being in the building is best, because I totally agree that parents partnering with the school is just about the best you can get. And when we can get in the building and we can read to children, and we can open milk cartons at lunch, and we can be at the high school as another adult presence in the room, that's the best. But we did learn that we can still advocate as PTA, even when we can't do those in-person things. So I would just close with, there's so many compelling reasons to consider a PTA at your site if you don't have one, because we do work for all children, and we want to partner with school and district leadership for the children and your school staff as well. So if you would like more info on joining a PTA or starting a PTA at your site in your area, you can email me at pres-elect@okpta.org. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Jane. That was great. I love the opening milk cartons at lunch. That brought back some memories. Anyway, thank you so much. Appreciate your comments. Next up, we have Kevin Sims. He is superintendent of Minco Public Schools. He's been in education for 28 years, though, first as a teacher, guidance counselor, principal, and currently superintendent. He's been superintendent of Minco Public Schools alone for 13 years. So thank you so much, Superintendent Sims, for being with us today. Looking forward to hearing how Minco has worked through this.
Let me interpret that for you, Michael Ann. There was a lot more hair and a lot less way to go when I started at Minco, but been here, we've had really 13 successful years, and a big part of our success here at Minco is because of volunteerism and the connection of everyday people, if you will, coming in and helping us achieve the goal of educating students. Last year was a great challenge, of course, because we did not have, to my knowledge, up to May, a single parent come in to volunteer to help, as compared to other years where we have a Minco parent-teacher organization that is very faithful to send people out weekly. Our Senior Citizen Center would always bring out people 2 to 3, 4 times a year so our students could read to them. Obviously, those things are beneficial educationally, but I think socially and to the psychology of the student, to their benefit, getting to be with other people, learning how to communicate, those things were greatly impacted by the lack of having those folks in school. I do appreciate Miss York, and I noticed some of the things she said, virtual and digital, those things play a role and can play a role. And I myself read to classrooms last year through Zoom. I used to go into there in person to our pre-K and kindergarten classes once a month, and I used Zoom to do that last year many times. But the role of volunteerism cannot be exaggerated for a school. And now that we're in this time of COVID, and I agree with you, Michael Ann, we thought, man, a few weeks before school started, I thought we were past this thing, and then here we are right back in the middle of it again. We're facing some of those same challenges, and maybe we have reinvented the wheel a little bit on how to involve parents in schools. And we're going to give it a shot and see how it goes this year with some reinventing of how we can involve volunteers and parents and grandparents and the such without making their physical presence on campus so much at this point until we see change. But I think this is a good webinar and a good meeting. We as administrators rely on organizations. Here at Minco, we have an outstanding Minco Education Foundation that doesn't just provide financial support for teachers, although I will say this little organization, over the last several years have provided over $100,000 in grants to our teachers, outstanding group, but they're here many times offering a helping hand with food items and things of that sort for kids and also teachers. And we have the Minco Parent Teacher Organization that is very active in the daily life of our students and involved with several things like that, such as reading and just providing students an opportunity to do things that maybe we wouldn't get to do otherwise. Jane, I really appreciated the digital field trips that you provided your elementary students. That was something that we didn't have last year, and that was something that was definitely missed. And one of the things we allow our elementary students to do is, our elementary classes to do, is go to a pumpkin patch annually in October. And obviously we did not do that this year. So we talked to a pumpkin patch and they brought the pumpkin patch to us. And by class, they were able to, we set up a nice little area out on the playground and they were able to take a pumpkin with them. And, things like that we had to be a little innovative. We did, and it worked out pretty well for us. But I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to get back to having volunteers and people in the school and getting back to where we were. This is not the way it was meant to be, but obviously we are adapting. So thank you for allowing me to share with you today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Superintendent Sims. Appreciate that. I love the pumpkin patch information, especially. It's so timely right here with our autumnal season. So next up, we have Tyler Bridges. Superintendent Bridges is currently at Clinton Public Schools and has been there since 2020, the 2020 school year. What a way to start out. Right there, right off the ball, right, with COVID. Anyway, prior to that, he was the Associate Director for School and Community Partnerships for the K-20 Center for Educational and Community Renewal for 3 years. He's been in the field of public education for 18 years in the capacity of an English language arts teacher, principal, assistant superintendent, and of course now superintendent. Superintendent Bridges holds degrees from the University of Central Oklahoma, Southern Nazarene University, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Oklahoma. So with that, we will turn it over to you, Superintendent Bridges.
Thank you. Again, thank you for having me. The input from Jane and Kevin both, I think, is really, really important when talking about volunteers in schools. And one of the things that we had actually discussed earlier this week in kind of brainstorming what we were going to talk about during this webinar was, obviously the way that we can determine how we can utilize volunteers, obviously in a COVID era. Hopefully we get to that post-COVID era that Michael Ann and Kevin were referring to, and that's what we all want. But unfortunately, I think this scenario we find ourselves in is going to be somewhat of the new reality. And we obviously have to find ways to safely deal with that, to ensure, because we have a very large responsibility to ensure the safety and health of our students and our employees. That is one thing that we talked about this last year a lot, was we have a tendency as educators to always focus on others and always focus on our students, and that's what we should focus on. But we also want to ensure that we're doing the right things and making the right choices for our employees as well, because they're in the same environment. And that was a very, very important thing. One of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit was just, we're really big on culture. We're really big on kind of understanding who the people are that we serve. And that had a lot to do this last year and has so far this year in determining how we're going to address the community being in our schools, volunteers being in our schools, people that provide different services that may not necessarily be employees of our schools, how we are going to handle them being in our schools. And one of the things that we've talked about is obviously everyone on here today that is in a school, and obviously everyone across the country and really the world, we're in the same situation, but a different situation at the same time. We're faced with the same enemy, I guess you can say, but we're all different in terms of the cultural makeup of our communities, in terms of how our communities, view this and how they respond to different things that we need to do in order to keep everyone safe. And I think that's an important aspect to make for sure that you take into account whenever designing protocols to keep people safe, in a COVID era. And one of the things that we feel like was very, very successful for us last year in addressing this, and also was this year, was just our communication and our transparency. We communicated early, and often about what the expectations were going to be, why we had to do those things, why we felt they were necessary, whether they were for our students or for volunteers or class parties or assemblies or field trips, whatever they were. We tried to make for certain that everyone, as the old saying goes, unless you're living under a rock, you understood what we were going to do and why we were going to do it. And I felt like that was a huge component in our success last year, in getting people to really have an understanding of why we were doing these things and have patience with us. And so far, this year, we're going to keep our fingers crossed, we're 5 days in, but 6 days. So far, we are seeing the same thing. We're still getting a lot of patience, a lot of understanding from people, because they do know the situation that we are unfortunately faced with, and that we're having to deal with, whether it's not our fault, so to speak. So one of the things specifically that last year we were, just like many others, completely locked down, did not allow volunteers in, did not have class parties and visitors, didn't have assemblies. And just like everyone, we found really creative ways to get around some of that. We had opportunities, just like Mr. Sims spoke about his pumpkin patch. We did something very, very similar, but we did several other activities and events throughout the year that we got volunteers to be involved, but they were not necessarily in our school. So they got to volunteer to create an experience for kids, or to put together, an opportunity for kids. But then we were able to take what work they had done and deliver it in our schools. And so we were still able to kind of give that feeling of our organizations, our PTA, our other parent organizations, our education foundation, like they were still providing a needed service, because they were to our schools and to our teachers, even though they weren't necessarily getting to deliver it face to face. And so we kind of found that happy medium. And of course, just like everyone else, we did a lot of virtual opportunities. We had Red Tornado Fridays where we, broadcast across our elementary schools, and had former Red Tornadoes come in and talk about, what they're doing in their life. And so some career exploration stuff, some activities to talk about, leadership and grit, and just a lot of really great conversations that kids got to be a part of. And I think was honestly more beneficial than having, 500 students come and all sit and, 50 of the 500 pay attention to what's going on. This was a smaller environment. They got to talk about it with their teacher. They had takeaway activities to do during the day based off of every Red Tornado Friday. And so there's just a lot of things that you can still do to incorporate people, and we can still be face to face, even in some of those, even if we're not necessarily in the same environment. And so I would just, my 2 cents on that to end is again, knowing your community, knowing what they're going to respond and react well to, being well organized, communicate a lot, be very, very transparent. And we made it through the entire school year and still had a lot of people involved in our kids' education, even though they may not necessarily have been within the walls of our schools. And we're kind of a hybrid of that this year. And we may have to unfortunately peel some of that back with the way cases and things are going. But hopefully we can continue to open the doors more to our public and bring them back in, because we all know that the school is a community. It's a representative of the community. It's the heartbeat of a lot of communities, and we need that community and volunteer connection in our schools for our kids.
Well, thank you, I loved what you said about the community of the school. Schools are the anchor of every community out there. They're essential to that community, the heartbeat, as you said, and they're reflective of the community. So if you want to get a pulse for what's going on in any city, town, community out there in Oklahoma, talk to the school officials, we always say. And part of that information I know you gain is from the volunteer experience that comes in or is done virtually, whatever is needed. So thank you, all three of you, for speaking. I appreciate it. So as I mentioned, now's the time we're going to look at the chat for questions. I threw one in there just to get us started. And that was, and I just lost the chat. I don't know where it went. Hold on one second. There it is. All right. So my first question is, forgive me, I'm having some technical difficulties. There we go. So as you were dealing with COVID last year, did you experience any bottom line adjustments that were needed due to the lack of or decreased number of volunteers? So I'm gonna pick on Superintendent Bridges, who just spoke, and ask him to speak first to this one.
For us, I mean, obviously, funding and things are tied to maybe some different sources that wouldn't necessarily always be affected by that. But one of the things that's really, really popular that we have here in Clinton is a very, very strong education foundation. And a lot of times, just kind of by proxy, they receive, donations and all of their, donations and things that they have given to them are turned right back around and given back to the school in forms of, scholarships and grant programs and teacher scholarship programs for master's degree or support staff for undergraduate degrees, those types of things. And so the involvement that we see from that, I think a lot of times gets people to where they're encouraged and a little bit more motivated to give to organizations like our foundation. And when they're not able to kind of see those things firsthand that are going on our schools because they're not in our schools, that kind of takes away that layer of, the positive word of mouth and people seeing it with their own two eyes, because if they're not there to see it, they don't obviously get to see it. And so that is one thing that we saw as a negative was, whenever we talk about, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. And that's why we're really, really big on communication, but not having people in your schools and seeing what's going on in your classrooms, whether it be parent volunteers or, people coming in to read to classes, or whether it's whatever, whenever they're in your schools, they see the amazing things that are happening, and they give, and they give of their resources and things, and their time. And I think we saw a little bit of a dip in that because those people were just not in our schools. And then also our activity funds suffered greatly just because, attendance at ball games, there for a while for anything indoors, we were limited by state mandate. We saw a lot of people that did not come out to football games, during the cold weather when the peak of COVID was happening. And so we saw a lot of those things that were detrimental, that we've had to offset a lot of activity funds, boosters. Clinton football is nationally renowned, one of the more successful programs in the state, and our booster club had the lowest amount of funds at the end of the season than they've had in who knows how long, just because people were just not out and about. And so we definitely did take a hit financially in those areas because of that.
Superintendent Sims, you want to add to that, please?
Well, I think Mr. Bridges absolutely hit on the major points there. One of the things that we used, which sometimes as administrators, we almost, when we hear the word social media, it's almost vile to us from some of the things that we've dealt with social media. But we use social media to our advantage last year greatly, of creating pages on Facebook and for the school and really providing the public and the community a visual of what we were doing in the classrooms and the things that we had going on. it really gave a sense of connection to the people. And I think that Tyler was dead on. Communication is the key. And that's something, you know, even with the COVID situation itself last year and thus this year, I give a weekly COVID update to our community so they understand what's going on in the school and in the community. You know, I'll just be blunt with you. Looking at some numbers I received this week, less than 30% of people that live in our zip code area have been vaccinated. And that's kind of an issue or a problem. I'm not sure how to approach that, to be honest with you, at this point, but I think that I can use social media and those communiques to get the message out there. Hey, this is what we need to do for our school district. With that being said, man, the budgets of our activities were adversely affected. Our booster clubs were adversely affected. And that's something we're dealing with right now. And, you know, just for an example, we've never charged admission for softball games, just to be honest with you. We've kind of floated that, and we always have great crowds at those things. We just did not have the money in our athletic budget to pay for umpires this year, just didn't. And so we had to start taking gated softball games, and we make just enough money, you know, to make sure those umpires are covered, but you have a lot of other expenses as well for uniform costs and things like that, man, it's made it challenging. So we've seen some of those negatives, and you know, I think all of us, regardless of size, are working through that because we all have a budget, and it's hard to meet some of those budgets. But I think Mr. Bridges hit those things head on, and he was very correct in his assessment.
Very good. Activities are so important. Again, they bring your community to the school, certainly. And when they are not there, they're definitely missed. So I have one for you, Jane, hold on. If you have answers to the previous question, please share that here. But I have one specifically for you that was shared with me. So how do you recruit new parents or parents who don't know anything about PTA, especially during COVID? Are you connecting at enrollment or through word of mouth? You have special social media situation? Kind of share that with us, how you're reaching out to those volunteers, especially now that, once again, I say with a lump in my throat, we are still in the midst of COVID.
So we get volunteer leadership in place in the spring of every year for every unit. Our elections are held March, April, May, so that we, over the summer, have leadership to work with. And as far as bringing in new people, social media is a huge part of that. Each one of our PTA units has a social media page. It might be in conjunction with the school they serve, or it may be separate. But they also each we utilize a program called Member Hub, and each one of them have a link to Member Hub. So I can go to my school PTA page, click and join. And within that site are opportunities listed for things that are needed for new volunteers to be able to get placed. I did see, though, just the other day that one of our, and maybe all, I don't know, but one of our elementaries is advertising a boohoo breakfast for kindergarten parents. And I'm not sure how that's going to be held, but I remember hosting boohoo breakfast, and boy, that's where we really recruit new volunteers. So I am certain that they will follow up with those people at that breakfast as well for new people. But right now, social media, you know, and just word of mouth is really the way to go.
Very well, thank you. So we do have another item in the chat. It says, I'm the HR director at a career tech. We have not experienced volunteer involvement until recently. What guidelines should be in place to allow volunteers on campus? So Kevin, I'm going to pick, Superintendent Sims, I'm going to pick on you first for this one.
Well, that would be pretty interesting. Typically, a career tech is going to have a lot more population that you deal with than what Minco Public Schools would have. So I would say you need something, and I know, in fact, Mr. Bridges was talking about lobby guard a few days ago, that's something I'm already checked into, Tyler. I was really impressed with that. I think you need something where there's some kind of check at the door or some type of system that highlights whether or not you want that person volunteering, just to be quite honest with you. I've not had too many issues at Minco with volunteers. We've had a couple that we've had to take care of those. But it is something that you do need some type of guidelines in place. And with our rising numbers, we're probably going to have to shut some things down, to be honest with you, here again at Minco. We've not done that just yet, but we went from last week having 3 COVID cases reported in the community up to 21. So there's obviously a problem there. And so we're going to have to revamp some of that as we move forward. But I do think, Ms. Simon, that you do need some type of system in place. Like I said, Tyler Bridges discussed it the other day about lobby guard. It's just something they can run their driver's license through, I believe, and he can be a little bit more clear on that to check a quick background check. But I do think you need some safeguards. I mean, it's always wonderful to have volunteers, but there have to be safeguards in place to protect your kids and protect your people. That's the most important thing I can think of with that. So I hope that answers the question, Michael Ann.
Absolutely. Superintendent Bridges, you have anything to add there?
Just in terms of, I agree with Mr. Sims in terms of, we do have something in place to kind of get a quick background on whoever's coming in to volunteer in our schools, but also kind of more related to COVID. We're asking all of our volunteers and people that come in that are outside. We obviously make for certain that they are not feeling ill the day that they enter our school, which I know seems a little bit funny to imply that we would need to ensure, but we need to make sure because a lot of people will, I just have a little bit of, I think it's allergies or, whatever. And then it turns out to be COVID. And so we're asking all of those people to mask up whenever they come in, even though we, cannot mandate our students and employees. We did have that last year for all students and employees district-wide the entire year. We're not able to do that this year, obviously, because of Senate Bill 658. So anyone that we do have come in, we ask if they do that and make for sure that they are, healthy prior to coming into our classrooms. But we're on a very, very limited basis of people coming into our classrooms that are our employees.
Very well. So another question, just ask each one of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Jane, to give us some top do's and don'ts in dealing with volunteers. It can be COVID, in the COVID environment and in the non-COVID, the non-COVID environment. So again, I'm going to begin with you, Jane, if I can, please.
I think a top do all the time is to thank your volunteers. I would ask our superintendent to just come in to a meeting and just say thank you. Sometimes that's all we need to hear is that that we're appreciated, because we do sometimes get lost in the shuffle and we look like employees because we're around many years, some of us. But I think that's really important to just to thank them for whatever they're able to give, if it's an hour a year or if they're serving on a board of directors at your site. I think that's really important. I do want to say something about the last question quickly, the lobby guard. Broken Arrow does use that as well and has for a few years, but recently they have added 6 questions and they're all health related. So you have to answer each one of those questions and it checks for a sexual predator background just real quickly before the badge will print. So, and also we had to have our temperature checked at any time we were coming into the building, which again was very few and far between. I substitute teach, so that's why that's fresh on my mind because I was allowed in to do that as well. But but back to your question about volunteers, yes, give them love.
Superintendent Sims, if you could add anything there, any don'ts, any do's that are top of mind to you when it comes to volunteers?
Well, I think that one thing is if you have a volunteer in, you want to know as an administrator what that volunteer is going to be doing, or the teacher needs to know what that volunteer is going to be doing. And they need to be isolated to a particular place. They don't need open roam of the campus, if you will. I think that's very important that there's communication that has gone on between you and the volunteer as to where, what your expectations of that volunteer is. You don't want someone roaming. For instance, a few years ago, we had a volunteer that came in for a class that was a parent, and but also at one time was an MMA fighter, if you will, and actually won a Golden Glove championship, which is pretty cool, I guess. But I get alerted that he is in the cafeteria after his time up in the classroom, and he is autographing kids' shirts and signing their arms and things of that sort. So I had to get him, and you can't be doing that, and it was he was a little intimidating too. He's a big old boy, but no, I mean, so you have to be careful with that, and you want to have communication with the volunteer and know when, or I'm sorry, where they're at and what they're doing. That's very, very important.
That sounds so good. I love your funny there, but you're right. Accountability for everyone in your facilities is important. Should something happen, certainly. And then as COVID is continuing, being able to know who was where and who might have been exposed to what, I bet that's important as well. So anyway, and then finally to you, Superintendent Bridges, do you have anything to add in that area? Specific don'ts, do's that we haven't already mentioned?
So a don't, and I think in our previous conversation earlier this week, Mr. Sims pointed to it, but making sure that volunteers, just like substitutes, understand rules and laws behind confidentiality. If they see something, if you have a volunteer in your school for very long, I'm sure our schools are no different than anyone else. They're going to see something that they may consider to be out of the ordinary, whether it's a child having a little bit of a meltdown, in kindergarten, or they may see a fight in the high school, or just all the things that you can see in a school, and they need to understand that those confidentiality is extremely important. They may hear conversations from students, or may hear them say things in class if they're helping to sub or redo a class or whatever, and just understanding that those aren't to be run out and put on Facebook, or talked about at the coffee shop with everyone in town, those kinds of things. But then on the positive side, we have gotten a lot of mileage out of some volunteers by simply having conversations with them and understanding what their true passions and talents are. We have some people who are infinitely talented in ways that we would really have no idea unless we asked. And we have been able to, we're a PLC district, professional learning community district. And so we have common collaboration time each week for every grade throughout the district. And, if we have 9 third grade teachers, that means we've got 180 kids that have to be somewhere. And so we do enrichment during that time, and they go to PE, they go to music, they go to the counselor, or a school nurse or a school resource officer or something like that. We've also been able to use some people in the community that are volunteers because they have talents and passions in some wild area, doing beadwork or creative writing, or just random things that kids are interested in and they think are fun. And once a week they get to go and do some of those kinds of things because we have people that have those talents that we have figured out that they want to share those talents with other people and those passions with other people. And just in asking them what they're interested in or what they're talented at, we have uncovered some of those things that we've been able to leverage in our schools. So I think that's a big do, is just talk to your people and find out what they want to do. They may not want to just make copies or make a new bulletin board. They may want to, they may have artistic abilities or whatever it may be that they can share with your students.
That's great. All of those are great ideas. I appreciate that. So with that, we'll close the chat at the moment and move on to Jason. If you can move to the next screen. I want everyone to have my contact information. Maybe there we go. And if you have any questions beyond after we've finished the webinar today, please email me and I'll be happy to find a good answer for you. So these webinars are very important to us, and your input regarding them is very important to us. We make note of what you suggest to us, and we work to improve this training program. So with that, we're going to ask for your input on a survey that's going to be emailed to every one of you who are participating today. We'll hope that you'll take a moment and actually jot down some thoughts regarding the webinar. And then after you submit your survey to us, a professional development certificate showing you completed today's webinar will be emailed your way. I also want to invite you to attend our next webinar. We do these every month. And our next webinar will delve into school planning. I mentioned at the beginning of this that school emergency operations plans are of tremendous importance to us. And so we're going to have the next webinar on just that, emergency operations plans for schools. That will be on September 16th at 1:30 p.m. Hopefully you can jot that down on your calendar now. More information to come. We always post information about our webinars in OSDE's School Administrators newsletter, or you can always contact me and ask for more information. Again, we're going to be posting today's webinar on our website, the OSDE website. So if you need more information, look there, or you can certainly email me. I want to thank the speakers again for taking their time today, as well as your participants for taking your time to be on today's webinar. I hope you found it useful. I hope it will help you in the future. My fingers are crossed that COVID goes away sooner than later. I know you all join me. And with that, today's webinar is over. Again, thank you for being on today's call. Take care. Be safe.